afternoon. Today we are concluding the second chapter of Esther and looking at the third chapter. We're going to get there in just a minute. But before we begin, I do want to note that we are winding down our study on Esther. We were in Ruth first, and now Esther. And so we just have a few weeks left. I want to ask, if you have a book of the Bible or a topic you would love for us to study, would you please let me know? Email me, respond in the comments, and I'll make sure that we look into that. The reason that I ask now, even though we have several weeks left, is because I have to look for content and then purchase it. Unless you just like to study, like I said, a book of the Bible, I can gladly write that curriculum. It's been somewhat easy to have a study guide to follow. Now we've gone off script a good bit, and we're going to do that a lot today. But I did want to make that topic available to you. With that, let's go ahead and dive into the conclusion of the second chapter. In the second chapter of Esther, what we found was that this culture was wicked. It was sinful. Men abused their power in disgraceful ways, and we talked about that the first week as well. But in the midst of a fallen world, and we still live in a very fallen world, in the midst of a fallen world, God still maintained his plan, and he still kept his covenant promises to his people. Now, as we've said throughout this, God is not named in this book, and he doesn't need to be. And I think that that's still significant for us to remember, is that we don't have to have a special revelation all the time. Say, well, that was God doing good things in your life. When God answers your prayers, I trust you don't have to have an angel shout out from heaven, God answered your prayer. God's around you. He's protecting you. He's encouraging you. We ought to be able to see through the lens of faith and to see God intervening in our lives. And indeed, even as we look over human history. And that's what we see here. And in his province, he allowed Esther, who was considerably beautiful, we're told, by the cultural standards of this day, of which I am unfamiliar, but she was very beautiful. And because of physical attributes, unfortunately, we're not given any indication that there was anything other than that attribute for which the king was looking for a queen. She is made the queen of Assyria. And so this is really a fascinating thing. So with that, we find Mordecai now having his position elevated. It's good to know people in power if you want to fill a position of power, and that's where Mordecai is here. It says, in those days, verse 21, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's officials, from those who guarded the door, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Xerxes. But the plot became known to Mordecai, and he told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. Now when the plot was investigated and found to be so, they were both hanged on gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. Now there's a few things that have taken place here. As I just alluded to, Mordecai no longer simply has a job, he has a position. His status in the kingdom has been elevated, just as Esther's has been, through God's providential plan, even in a fallen world. We're going to see how this is so, or what the plan is going to be here. Well, really today we're going to look at sort of the negative situation. It's going to get even worse for these people. We're going to see that God was 2 steps ahead of the enemy. Satan had a plan. God knew about it. He was prepared, and he had his people in place to respond, and that's important to note. The other thing we can note here from just a natural vantage point is that King Xerxes really was not a good, a just, or even a reasonable leader. In many ways, he failed. He failed as a leader. He failed as a man. So when we see, well, these people want to come up and kill him, now, again, we don't think that anybody should ever be killed, my goodness, or assassinated, which would be this case. But we do understand that in this context, these things did take place to kings, and he was a king who was really unfavorable. Remember, this is after the attempt to attack Greece has failed, and so probably from many he is looked down on very sharply. So just to kind of explain the historical context, if you're wondering, well, why do they want to assassinate him? We don't know the specific reason, but we do know that he failed in many ways. Now, that doesn't make this justifiable in any way, but just to explain kind of the historical context there in case we're wondering. But God allowed through his providence the king's life to be spared. And his life isn't just spared, it is spared because Mordecai is put in a position where he overhears, or maybe is even asked to be a conspirator of, we're not told, but he becomes aware of the plot, and he intervenes. And how does he intervene? He goes to Queen Esther, and he mentions this, and then his name's recorded in the history books. This account is historical. This really happened, and we find further documentation of that. The Bible so often goes out of its way to remind us of the fact that this is historically true. This is accurate. Picking up in the 3rd chapter, it says, after these events, King Xerxes promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and established his authority over the princes who were with him. All the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai, and that's going to be key here, but Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, why are you transgressing the king's command? Now it was when they had spoken daily to him, and he would not listen to them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's reason would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage to him, Haman was filled with rage, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him who the people of Mordecai were. Therefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. This story takes a sudden and dramatic turn here. And let's go ahead and unpack this. I'm not really going to spend time looking at the questions today, but instead unpacking this chapter, because I think it's a fascinating chapter in so many ways. Disturbing would probably be the more appropriate way to phrase that. You might note, by the way, this is a side topic, but my cup this week says faith. Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. It doesn't provide the whole verse, but Amy gave me a little pushback on the fact that I was using a Halloween cup and said, well, people are going to think that you're endorsing Halloween with your videos. And I said, well, I hope they'd understand that I'm endorsing the clearance aisle at Walmart, because I bought that cup because it was 25 cents. I only care about what's in the cup. But anyways, so we come to the 3rd chapter here, and we find that after these events, so after what events? After Mordecai has delivered the king was going to be assassinated, and through God's gracious activity in Xerxes' life, certainly, he allows Xerxes to live, and Mordecai is the hero of the story to this point. Does Mordecai get elevated into a new position? No. After these things, Haman does. Now, Haman, we are not given a lot of information about. What we are given is his genealogy, and we're going to get there in a minute. But we might first wonder, well, why won't Mordecai bow down to Haman? We might think that there are religious reasons for that. Perhaps he was not able to pay tribute to somebody who was a political leader over him. That's not at all the case. Nowhere in Scripture does it condemn such behavior. In fact, today we recognize through Romans 13, other passages in Scripture, that government was ordained by God. He has placed people in authority over us. We pray for our leaders. We should. God has called us to. We show respect unto them. I call whoever the President of the United States is Mr. President, or President Trump, now President Biden, President Obama, President Bush before, twice, and so we say we recognize people's status, their position of authority, because God has allowed them to be put into those positions of power. So there's no reason spiritually that Mordecai did not bow down. So why didn't he bow? Well, one of the assumptions we might have is perhaps he did not appreciate Haman's character. Likely he was aware of him. And from what we have revealed about Haman's character, there really is nothing to respect. As I talked in the first chapter about the fact that if you want people to respect you, King Xerxes does, well, then he needs to treat people better. Forcing his wife, the queen, Vashti, to show respect unto him in an immoral way, in a way that I believe was exploitive and abusive. He should not have demanded such a response from her or even expected it, because he wasn't worthy of respect. Haman here apparently is a man who's not worthy of respect either. One man doesn't bow down to him, and his response is, let's kill everybody that is related to him. Let's kill all of the Jewish people. Now, this is disturbing, and it tells you that this man is a monster. I don't know how else you frame that. He is a despicable person, one of the great enemies in human history, especially had he been able to pull this off. Thankfully, we're going to find in a couple weeks here, thankfully, he's not able to pull it off because God intervened. But nevertheless, the same sort of wickedness that ran rampant in Hitler's heart was in Haman's heart as well. And so we need to understand the sort of hatred that he had. But we might ask another question. In addition to maybe being aware of his character, being aware of Haman's character, is there potentially another reason that Mordecai would not bow? And the answer to that's yes, certainly. What we have is a genealogy provided for Haman. We're told that he is an Agagite. Well, who's that? Well, if you were to look back, I want us to remember that, well, I'm going to ask you a question. You can reflect on this. I'm not going to know the answer, so you don't have to feel guilty if you don't remember. But what tribe did Mordecai and Esther come from? If you guessed Benjamin, you'd be correct. If you remember, Benjamin. Okay. Now, who was the first king of Israel? Saul. And what tribe did Saul come from? Benjamin. What king did he not strike down, though he was told to do so, and all of his corresponding people? Well, that would be King Agag of the Amalekites. Okay? Haman is a descendant of that king. So this reference to his genealogy is not just some random side note that's thrown in here. We're told that there has been a conflict between the Amalekites and, well, we know there's been a conflict between the Amalekites and the Jewish people since the Jews entered the Promised Land under the leadership of Joshua. And so there's real conflict here that goes back many generations, and even making it more personal than a difference of nations that have clashed between the Amalekites and Israel. We find that the tribe of Benjamin is represented here, and King Agag's descendants are represented here. And we have no idea how an Amalekite came to occupy this sort of power in the land, but nevertheless he has. And that's the reason I believe that it says, but he, Haman, disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him who the people of Mordecai were. Therefore, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews. He thought, you know what? The Jewish people, under King Saul, they wiped out most of the Amalekites. Most of my family lineage, they wiped out. Now I have an opportunity to do the same to them, but I am going to finish the job. Now, God sending Saul, by the way, was an act of judgment. I've spoken before that God judges nations by sending other nations to bring judgment on them. And I need us to understand that. What we find here is the enemy's perverse plan to create a parody of God's plan. Rather than bringing judgment upon a sinful land, the enemy so works in Haman's heart to encourage him to strike down God's covenant people. And so this is a mockery of God's good plan and the plan he has to judge the nations. So we have this historical context in here. Next, this letter goes out. Haman approaches the king. The king agrees. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's kill all the Jewish people. It is unbelievable the amount of anti-Semitism that has existed in the world and still exists today. As God's people, we love the Jewish people. Our desire should be that of the Apostle Paul in Romans 9. He wished that all of the Jewish people would come to saving faith in Jesus Christ. That should be our desire. Any group, class of people who are hated, who are abused, who are misaligned, mistreated, we should contend for their cause. We should love them. We should pray for them. We should be advocates for them. Here, we find that apparently King Xerxes is more than happy to go along with Haman's plan, and likely there's some anti-Semitism that runs in his heart. He sees that it's prevalent in his country, and of course, to this point, he has no idea that his bride, his queen, is Jewish. And this was part of God's plan, perhaps, to protect Esther, to put her in a position in which she would have authority to stop the plans of Satan as expressed through Haman. The last verse of this chapter is almost haunting. It's very interesting. It says, "The couriers went out, impelled by the king's command, while the decree was issued at the citadel in Susa, and while the king and Haman sat down to drink, the city of Susa was in confusion." You have two very different worlds. You have these who are in power, who are drinking the lust of that power, celebrating the kind of moral depravity that they are walking in, and they're expressing their power by destroying a whole people, or attempting to. And so they offer this decree, and they sit back and they're drinking. They're enjoying this like it's just another pleasantry, like it's almost entertaining to them, or maybe even on some level worse, as though they're completely indifferent to it. Okay, that's what we're going to do, so let's have a drink and just relax, kick back our feet. The rest of the city, people are in a lot of confusion. Why is this happening? We're going to kill a whole group of people? For what? Those are the sorts of questions that are likely going around, and of course people then are likely to try to figure out, well, who are the Jewish people? Which people are Jewish? Because apparently some people have concealed their nationality. So there's a lot of things unfolding here. In the upcoming weeks, we're going to unpack this and talk about some of the application points of it. But what I want us to see here, as far as what we can take away, is that hatred, when it boils over, it often results in shocking responses by people who have allowed hate to control their hearts. People react in ways that are irrational, irresponsible, and do not at all fit the situation. As God's people, we need to not allow any sort of hatred, bigotry to harbor in our hearts. Second, in this, in the chapter and the partial chapter that we read, we need to continue to see God's hand of guidance in our world, His divine program being played out before our eyes. In all times and in all ways, God is actively at work. So let's recognize His work. Let's give thanks to Him. I look forward to continuing this study next week. May the Lord bless you.